totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website bookedonrock.com. Our guest is Gillian Gaar. She's here to talk about her new book, Elton John at 75. Few rock artists continue to gather more and more adulation with age. Sir Elton Hercules John is an exception who proves the rule. In Elton John at 75, veteran rock journalist Gillian Gaar presents a unique and beautifully produced celebration of the iconic and beloved rock star, examining Sir Elton through the lens of 75 career accomplishments and life events. Key studio albums are featured, of course, as are a curated selection of his earworm singles. But Gaar delves deeper to reveal the events that helped chart the course of Elton's career, including key performances, such as his breakthrough performance at LA's Troubadour and the historic Soviet Union and Dodger Stadium concerts, legendary collaborations with the likes of George Michael, Billy Joel, and Kate Bush, his many film and television roles, including Tommy and the Muppet Show, tireless work on behalf of AIDS research, notable awards and honors, including knighthood, and of course, his collaboration with longtime co-writer Bernie Taupin. Every page is illustrated with stunning concert and candid offstage photography, including gig posters, 7-inch picture sleeves, and more. It's an incredible package, which also includes a gatefold Elton John timeline, a previously unpublished gatefold artwork, an 8x10-inch glossy print, and a pull-out poster. The result is a stunning tribute to one of the most admired stars in rock in a milestone year. Gillian Gaar has written for numerous publications, including Mojo, Rolling Stone, and Goldmine. Previous books include She's a Rebel, The History of Women in Rock and Roll, Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana, Return of the King, Elvis Presley's Great Comeback, The Doors, The Complete Illustrated History, and Boss, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, The Illustrated History. She joins us from her home in Seattle. To hear a playlist of Elton John, including the songs we discuss in this episode, you know what to do. Head over to the show notes page. Gillian Gaar, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here.
This is more than just a great read. This is a coffee table book. This is beautifully put together.
Yeah, I mean, they added a lot of, I guess they call them assets, things, a poster you can pull out, and there's an envelope with memorabilia and stuff. And, well, yeah, being in orange, it kind of catches your attention.
Well, as we know, Elton caught the attention of many throughout his career, and music was a part of Elton's life pretty much from day one. Can you take us back to his beginnings? Elton said that if the radio wasn't playing in the home, there was a record spinning on the radiogram. What was life like as a child for Reginald Kenneth Dwight?
Well, he came from a pretty average, maybe we'd say more of a middle class kind of background. Certainly wasn't working class. They had enough money to get by, but not a lot of extra money. The radio brought the world to you. Remember, this is post-war Britain that he's growing up in. So that time is thought of as being kind of drab and unexciting, and everything exciting came from America. And of course, you could get that on the radio or through record players, through records, and the movies, of course, the cinema, as they would say.
When does he start playing the piano?
He sounds like one of those natural talents who just starts playing as a child. One of those people who they sit down at the piano, and unlike most of us who have to try and figure out what note is this and how does it go together, it just sort of came together for him. He did take lessons. You do need some formal training, and he had that going on. But he just had that natural ability to begin with, which I always think that's fascinating because I was in the school band. So I know what it's like to learn how to play an instrument and to play one and be in a group and do performances, which is actually kind of useful going on to be a writer.
Yeah, it's amazing. A lot of these musicians, you'll hear them say, I don't even know how to read music. I just play by ear.
Well, sometimes it seems with some of these people, they have such a natural talent that formal training kind of works against them and they get inhibited. They need to do it their own way.
What about Elton the Performer? He had a life-changing moment when he saw Elvis Presley in Life magazine. His mother brought home the Heartbreak Hotel single. While that sparked his desire to dress up and be a showman, it was actually Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Little Richard who inspired him most to be a performer. You write about how he starts kicking away the piano during early shows, just like Jerry Lee.
Yeah, he saw that. I mean, the problem with the piano is that, it's a static instrument. When you think of a rock band, everyone can move around, well, except the drummer. But, the front line, it's the guitars and bass, right? And they can move around and strike poses and all that. And obviously, you can't do that with a piano. You're stationary. You have to sit there. But he saw how both Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, who played the piano, just made it as visual an experience as they could. They'd play by standing up, which was unusual. And then if you've seen footage of them, how they'd pound away at the piano, pound away, pound away. And Jerry Lee would get particularly athletic and enthusiastic and, kick the piano bench away. Always a great showstopper. And Elton picked up on that and, began doing it just, when he joined his own bands as a teenager and would pull it out at just the right moment. You can't do it all the time or it kind of loses its specialness. You have to reserve it for those peak moments.
Elton's first single is called Comeback Baby, released in July of 1965, and it's with the band Bluesology, which I think was his first band. He's credited as Reg Dwight. Who is Bluesology, and how does this gig lead to the birth of the name Elton John?
Well, Bluesology was it wasn't his first band because he was in a band in what we would consider their equivalent of high school. And then after leaving school, he got in Bluesology, which, as you could guess from the name, was meant to be more of a blues band, although you hear Comeback Baby and it's not really that bluesy. This wasn't the British blues that came later of Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds and that kind of thing. This maybe more a cabaret, more a popular style element to it in there. Not quite as underground. No Skip James, we'll say, or anything like that. But yeah, it was so that was where he started with that. It's interesting to hear because it's Elton John's first single, or Reg Dwight, as you say, because that was the name he was born with, Reginald Dwight. But it's okay. It's not great. It's interesting because it's Elton's first single that he appeared on. But if no one else notable had been on that record, we probably wouldn't be listening to it today.
The name Elton John, so it comes from two members of Bluesology?
Yeah, towards the end of his stay with them, he wanted to, he decided the band really wasn't going to go anywhere. Long John Baldry had come in as lead singer now, and they would be playing in the cabarets and casinos around England, and he just didn't think it was going where he wanted to go or doing the kind of music he wanted to do. He was more and more in the background and not even singing now that Long John Baldry was there. So he left and he decided that, Reginald Dwight didn't really seem like a rock and roll name, which it doesn't really. So he took two names from two people in Bluesology and created Elton John. I think it was Elton from Elton Dean, and he wanted to take his name completely. And that Elton was like, no, I don't think that's going to happen. So he compromised by taking someone else's name so he couldn't be mistaken for one of these other two former band members he'd played with.
So Elton John, the stage name, is born, and then I want to ask you about when he officially changes that name a little bit. But let's talk about Bernie Taupin now. It's amazing to think that Elton's partnership with Bernie began with almost an afterthought. An envelope handed to Elton would change the course of his career and his life. Can you take us back to that moment when Elton finds out about Bernie Taupin?
Well, one of the fascinating things about Elton John's career is just how random incidents just played such a major factor. You used the word afterthought, and you could see that's exactly how it would be described. Elton had been meeting with someone at Liberty Records hoping to get signed by them, and they weren't really interested in signing him. And then the A&R guy said, "Oh, well, you're looking for a lyricist. Well, I just got these lyrics mailed to me. This guy's looking for a musician to work with." And he hands him this envelope of Bernie's lyrics. Now, what if Elton had been meeting with another A&R guy that day who didn't have those lyrics with him? Or what if those lyrics arrived the day after Elton had been meeting with the A&R guy? They would have just been two ships passing in the night and never connected. Even before it was sent, Bernie had written the lyrics and written his nice letter to Liberty and had them in an envelope and put them on the mantelpiece at his home. And then he just got distracted and forgot to mail it. And so it was his mother noticing it sitting there. "Oh, Bernie, you've left this here. This should be mailed." And she saw to it that it was mailed. So, thanks, Mom.
Yeah. And was Bernie from the area?
Not really. He was from, I can't really pronounce the name of where he came from, but it was outside of London. It was very rural. He was, working on a chicken farm. But he had greater aspirations than life on the chicken farm. He was a country boy, really. And Elton was very suburban, but to Bernie, he seemed like the city sophisticate. But, he'd been into London enough and worked in London, so he felt more comfortable with it.
So that explains songs like Country Comfort and songs like that. That's where it comes from Bernie's upbringing then. A lot of that country.
Yeah. All he had in the rural wilds was his imagination. I think that's why his lyrics were so fanciful.
Did Bernie have his sights set on his own solo career? Did he want to be a singer? Did he want to be in a band?
He just wanted to write. He had a job at a newspaper, and he'd hoped that he could progress in that field, but he was just, he didn't really go anywhere there. So that's how he ended up at the chicken farm. And I think at the time he wasn't really sure what he wanted to do. He just knew he wanted to get out of where he was and just do something interesting and creative. And he had a skill with writing. And of course, rock lyrics had matured a lot by then. They weren't just the very simple beat music type of lyrics, but with Bob Dylan, he'd sort of introduced the idea that, your lyrics can be interesting, they can be creative, and say something beyond, I love you, baby, etc. So that inspired him a lot too. And of course, by the late 60s, you have all the psychedelic groups reaching for meaning, fanciful or otherwise. And, some of that stuff was kind of over the top, but still that, there was other work that was good and resonant and has lasted. And I think that inspired him too. It was a very rich, creative field by that time.
Now, when Elton was a session player, was he at that time, did he know Bernie when he was a session player, or was that before he meets Bernie?
I think it was before and during, actually, because Elton was trying to bring money in any way he could. He'd quit bluesology, so he didn't have that money coming in, and he'd work as a session musician on other people's sessions, and he'd be recording his own stuff, trying to get people interested in that. But session work could be pretty lucrative. That's a really fun part of his career that people didn't know about for a long time, because especially in those days, there weren't really musician credits on records aside from the main person, by such and such band or such and such singer. They didn't list everyone else that played on the record. So he actually was on a lot of hit records before he made them in his own right.
What are some of the standout singles from that period, which would have been, 68 to 70, right?
Yeah, well, Tom Jones' Delilah was one of them. Of course, huge hit for Tom Jones. He was on one of the Scaffolds records. And he also, I found this really interesting, he would appear on these budget records where they were doing covers of the hit songs in the hit parade. And then they just pile them on a budget compilation. Instead of having the original versions of the hit records, it would be these remakes. And so he would do all these remakes. And the one that always fascinates me is he did To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. So
Wow.
I always thought, who thought to pair him with that song?
Yeah.
The suburban white guy singing To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. He does a decent enough job with it, but it's still, a strange concept. Now you can find compilations of those recordings of his, because of course he became a superstar, and so the early work is more interesting. And I've seen them advertised on Amazon, these compilations that just bring together all these songs. In the Summertime was another one he did. That would be just right for his voice.
The Mungo Jerry song. That's right. Now,
yeah.
Does he get publishing from those songs today? I
doubt it. I don't think he said, but just, from what I know of the music business, I'm sure it was probably just a work for hire thing.
Yeah. Not that he
needs it. He
needs
didn't write the songs. He's just playing on it. I don't know if they would get performers royalties. Since they were budget compilations, I suspect you probably just got offered a flat fee to do it. These things were just, the turnover was really fast. They'd get out, a release of the last 2 months' top 10 records, but then in a few months, no one is going to want to buy that album anymore.
But it was a nice gig to fall back on if his career didn't take off. But we know what happened with his career. It took off. Didn't take off, though, with this album, Regimental Sergeant Zippo. This is the debut Elton album that almost was. What is this album?
Yeah, it came out a few years ago for Record Store Day. And I believe they're going to They either have released it or are going to release it, like as a regular album instead of the limited edition thing. It was, well, obviously the name play on Sgt. Pepper came out a year later. Probably a good reason why it didn't come out at the time with that title. It's just an early collection of his and Bernie's work, and a lot more fanciful than the later stuff they do, I think. Kind of very flowery, and they give it this psychedelic cover, the album cover, all the paisley psychedelic colors. It was probably a good thing it didn't come out. I think it might have just typed him too much and tied him in too much to psychedelia, and that wasn't really who he was. He's more the classic singer-songwriter.
And a great example of that, your song, which is moment number 10 in your book, written in 5 minutes, recorded in 2, according to your book.
Probably took a little longer than 2, because the song's longer than 2 minutes, so
yeah.
Take longer than that.
Talk about this song, which is, as you write, a turning point in the career of Elton and Bernie. When and where is this one written?
Well, what's amazing about these big hits is that they did come together so quickly. Again, it's sort of hard for me to conceive that Bernie would write these lyrics and then he'd give them to Elton, and in less than an hour Elton would have the melody for it. And they were staying at Elton's parents' home, or actually the home of his mother and his stepfather, so not quite parents. Here they are, guys in their 20s, and they're living in bunk beds at Elton's parents' home, because at that point they didn't really have the money to go to get a place of their own. And Bernie came down and gave Elton these lyrics at breakfast. And Elton said, oh, he knew he had to up his game. He thought, yeah, these are very special. I've really got to do a good job on this one. And he did, obviously. And then it just came together, and it's a very personal song. And I keep saying the word flowery, but, Bernie kind of had that sort of lyrical style, which, almost Baroque, you would say. And I think maybe that would make it easy to not take us seriously, because you think, oh, he's just trying too hard by trying to be clever. But there's a simplicity about it and a real human feeling. And I think that's what people responded to when they heard it.
For somebody like yourself who's interviewed musicians, the chances of this partnership like this, it's rare to have the person say, here are the lyrics, and then the other guy say, I'll come up with the music, and have it turn out the way it has throughout the years. It's a magical partnership, but not something that happens often. Like, I think of Jerry Garcia and Robert Hunter. He would give him the lyrics and Jerry would make the music, but it's not something that I would think most of the time if you pair two people together, it's not going to work. But this sure did. Yeah,
they almost write like the classic songwriters for musicals, those kind of partnerships, like Rodgers and Hammerstein or Lerner and Lowe, who would do a similar thing, although I don't know that they necessarily wrote that all separately. They might have worked on some of those together, putting the song together. But yeah, it was unusual that there were a few exceptions, but for most of the time, they would just do these things completely separately. And that is unusual, because sometimes even if one person is doing the lyrics or the music, they come together when the song is coming together. And the music writer, the composer, might say, well, can you alter that line a bit so it fits this melody? Or the lyricist would say, well, the melody shouldn't go up like that. It should go down like this, make contributions back.
But it wasn't like that.
Yeah, they would. Yeah. Sometimes that would happen, but by and large it didn't. So that was unusual. Elton said that Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice worked the same way, which helped Elton when he worked with Tim Rice later. But yeah, there's another partnership. But those other songwriting teams that I mentioned, including Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, they weren't performers either. So it's unusual for performers to do that too.
And as you said, they're from two different backgrounds. Elton and Bernie are from two different backgrounds. So that's also interesting that they just connected like that. So let's get to Elton's appearance at the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles, because this is a huge moment. August of 1970, glowing review in the LA Times. The rest of Elton's run sells out, and from this point on, he's only getting bigger and bigger. So he releases Tumbleweed Connection, Madman Across the Water, Honky Chateau, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player between 1970 and early 73. And it's also during this time that Elton legally changes his name. And you write about the breaking point for Elton. Can you talk about that? It has to do with a credit card.
Oh yeah, that's right. When he was out shopping, or a check maybe instead of a credit card, because his legal name was Reginald Dwight, and Elton John was the stage name. And so he'd be trying to buy things, and I think it was a check, because though it could have been a credit card, that was in the name of Reg Dwight, and they wouldn't accept it because they knew him as Elton John. He'd say, "Well, this is my legal name, though," but they didn't want to accept that. So he decided, okay, I'll make Elton John official, my legal name, so that everyone knows I'm Elton John, and I'll have the ID to back it up. And so he changed his name to Elton Hercules John.
Yes. And where does Hercules come from?
The horse in Steptoe and Son, apparently, not the mythological hero of yore. Steptoe and Son was a British sitcom of the early 60s. Steptoe in that was the actor Wilfred Bramble. He played Paul's very clean grandfather in A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, very cool. I didn't know that. Now, in October of 1973, Elton releases what is one of the greatest albums in rock history, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Elton didn't intend to make a double album, but the songs, they just kept coming. But things get off to a bumpy start. What happened, and how does Elton and his band eventually get the album completed?
Oh, yeah, they went to Jamaica because the Stones had just recorded there. They said, oh, we'll have a great time in Jamaica. But they didn't really have a great time in Jamaica. The studio was next to a record plant where there was a strike going on, so they got hassled going to and from. And the studio itself wasn't in great shape, and the recordings they made just sounded terrible. So they thought, let's get out of here. And they went back to the French chateau that they'd been using for the previous albums. And one reason they didn't go there to begin with was because it was booked. But now, because they'd spent all the time going to Jamaica and trying to work and not working, by the time they decided to leave, the chateau was going to be available. So they just, okay, we'll go back to the chateau. So they went there to do it. And Elton did say one positive thing about the Jamaica trip was that he wrote a lot of the songs there. He'd spent a lot of time in his hotel room because he didn't want to go out. He didn't feel particularly safe. So he just spent his time writing. So they were pretty much ready to go when they got to the chateau. And yeah, as you said, the songs just kept coming and coming, and they just thought, these are all too good. We can't just slim down to one album. It's hard to pull off a double album and make it worthwhile. But, he clearly did on that one.
It's classic. And then he follows with Caribou, Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, and Rock of the Westies. That marks the halfway point of the decade. So from 70 to 75, he released singles like Your Song, Leave On, Tiny Dancer, Rocket Man, Honky Cat, Crocodile Rock, Daniel, Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Benny and the Jets, Candle in the Wind, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, The Bitch Is Back, Philadelphia Freedom, and Someone Saved My Life Tonight. I mean, it's an insane run. I mean, there's about a handful of number one singles in there. The rest in the top 5 or top 10. 7 straight number one albums. So my question to you is, where would you place that among the greatest 5-year runs in rock? Because we've got the Beatles from 65 to 69 is huge. The Stones, 68 to 72. I think of Zeppelin, 71 to 75. Where do you put that, Elton's run?
The Beatles might be one up because I think overall their work was more innovative. If you think from Please Please Me to Let It Be, or to Abbey Road, really the last album. Please Please Me to Abbey Road. The change in style and the recording techniques too. We have to give them credit for that. All the innovations they did, like inspiring the creation of artificial double tracking and other things that we don't need to go into because we're talking about Elton. Yeah, I guess I'd put them up there. But it also shows you, when you were saying a few minutes ago, you were listing the album names. Oh, and then he did this, and I thought, man, that's such a difference to how things are today, where a big artist will put out an album every 2 to 3 years. He's just churning them out, putting them out, but they're all good. Yeah. They're not filler.
2 in 1 year, I think, at one point. Didn't he have 2? Yeah, he had one at the beginning of the year and at the tail end of the year. Yeah. I mean,
yes. Certainly the Beatles and Stones would have operated that way in the early 60s. Yep. 2 albums a
year. Yep. Now, the second half of the 70s didn't go so well for Elton. You got Blue Moves, A Single Man, Victim of Love are the albums that were released between 75 and 79. What do you attribute the decline to? Was it his split with Bernie? Was it drugs? Was it, I know he came out in Rolling Stone. Was it all of that combined, or sort of came out?
I think it was all of that combined. I mean, I think he was just getting burned out. I mean, we've just mentioned making the records, but along with that, he was also touring, around the world. So he's making all these records in between all these tours that he's constantly going around doing. And he said himself when he did his shows at Dodger Stadium, the 2 shows where he's wearing that fabulous Bob Mackie designed Dodgers baseball outfit, that, he said, I knew that this level of success could not last and that you have to come down a bit. And in fact, after that, in like 77, he basically took a year off. And I think he just felt he needed to find a new direction. That's one reason he and Bernie stopped working together, to bring a change. They'd worked together. Well, by then, I guess it would have been about a decade. And yeah, it's good to have a change. They never saw it as permanent necessarily. They thought, we'll probably get back together.
Okay, because I was going to say, it wasn't a fallout. It wasn't any battles between the two, or was there any tension there, or was just, you know what, I'm going to do my thing, you do yours?
Yeah. I think they thought, yeah, we could use some time apart. And, I think Bernie wanted to do some writing for other people, see what that was like. Certainly drugs were a factor. I think, I can't remember, it was the Caribou or the Rock of the Westies album, but one of the albums that they made at the Caribou Ranch, it was Bernie said, there was more snow inside the studio than outside.
Yeah, that's Rock of the Westies. I remember reading that. Yeah.
Because everyone was overindulging at the time. I don't think this was in my book, but just a sign of how far out things could get, that Elton was having a party at whatever mansion he had rented in LA. This might not have been the 70s, maybe it was later, but it's a good story. So, and he was just so out of it that he started berating this man he saw kind of wandering around the party, who was dressed down, and we were saying, who is that? Is that the gardener? What's the gardener doing at my party? And someone pulled him aside and said, that's Bob Dylan.
Oh, I've never heard that story. Oh.
And then George Harrison told him, Elton, you might just be overdoing it a little.
Yeah. I mean, the schedule he was on, the cocaine was going to keep him moving and keep him awake. I mean, it's like tour, record. I mean, and then once you're a success, the labels are like pushing him back out there. You're not stopping. We're on a roll. Let's keep going.
Yeah. Won't last forever. We got to get it while we can.
Yeah. Well, so his comeback album is 1983's Too Low for Zero, and he teams up with Bernie Taupin again, and then he brings back the original Elton John band, which is important too. Guitarist Davy Johnstone, bassist Steve Murray, and drummer Nigel Olsson. We want to mention those guys. What led to his reunion with Bernie and the rest of the bandmates?
Well, I think part of it maybe was, trying to get a bit more success, because the records had not done as well. And yeah, he'd let his musicians go, which they were very disappointed about. Again, there wasn't a falling out, but he just felt the need to make a change. It reminds me of what Bruce Springsteen did.
I was just about to say that, yeah.
Late 80s after the Amnesty tour.
You're right, yeah. Yeah, even with Tunnel of Love. Yeah, Tunnel of Love, you kind of had a few of the guys there, and then early 90s with Human Touch and Lucky Town. They were all gone, except for Roy Bittan.
Yeah. But he said, we're broken up. Because, he wanted to do something new and different. I think also he, in the case of Bruce, was looking back at that massive success with Born in the USA, and he wasn't the kind of person that was just going to do the same album again. So in order to do that, he thought, maybe I need some new people. But obviously, as we've seen, he's brought those guys back too. In fact, I think he's touring with them now. That's the band he's with now.
So similar with Elton then, just it's time for a change. Yeah. Especially when you're going to be around that long, there's going to be some ebbs and flows, ups and downs. You're going to try different things. The music scene is changing. So I remember Elton, he had a song that was a semi-hit during the disco era. Not the Kiki D one, but there was another one where he was like a top 40 single, but they're not songs that you remember. They're not songs he plays live anymore. So it's an interesting look back at his career. Are there any of those albums or songs you like from the second half of the 70s?
Well, some of the tracks that he recorded with Tom Bell, the sort of, the so-called Philly Soul sessions, which he started here in Seattle, which I didn't know until doing this. He was here. Made me wonder, where did he stay? Was he at the Olympic Hotel, the the fanciest hotel downtown at that time. It still is, classic old school established hotel. I like those. Let's see. What album is I'm Still Standing on? That's the next one I really remember hearing that stood out.
Yeah,
I like
that one is, that's the comeback song, and that would be from, I believe, Too Low for Zero, which I'm glad you mentioned that, because I don't think you can't go wrong with the title Rocket Man for Elton's biopic, but I think I'm Still Standing would have been perfect too, because you talk about that is Elton. He's taken some hits, many hits over his life and career, and just kept coming back, and I'm still standing, here I am. That would have been a cool title for the movie, I thought.
Takes a licking, but keeps on ticking.
Yeah. And in the 80s, the thing is, he had some standout moments. He was at Live Aid. Sometimes I forget about that, but then he had his Live in Australia concert. But an interesting one you cite is his lawsuit against the Sun. This is a moment of vindication, you call it in the book. What led to the lawsuit? How does Elton end up on the winning end of this?
The British tabloids are just notorious for looking for the most exploitative kind of story they can splash on their papers. This is in the days when print was really big. It was fascinating to be in London and just think how many tabloids they had. I mean, granted, London's one of the biggest cities in the world, but still an enormous number of newspapers in this town. And so that's also partly, I think, why the business became so cutthroat, because of all the competition. And some of these stories, they're not necessarily going to be that accurate. And Elton just felt he was liable by these stories. It said he had been off with some male prostitutes at, I think it was Rod Stewart's manager's house. And the other celebrities, like Mick Jagger, who just said, don't sue him. It takes forever. And then no one ever hears when the case is settled. So they only remember the main story. They don't remember that it was thrown out later. But the more Elton thought about it, he just thought, no, I'm not going to take this. So he did take them to court. And when you read about it in detail, there's lots of articles you can find online that sort of do the chronology of what happened, how the Sun just kept, they didn't back down for a long time, and they insisted they were right and said Elton was a liar. And they kept coming up with more stories. Like one of the most outrageous was that he said that it was claimed that his dogs barked too loud and would keep him awake at night. So he had their voice boxes cut, their larynxes removed, so they couldn't bark. And so someone from not the ASPCA, I guess it'd be the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals, shows up at Elton's home, where the representative could meet the dogs, who certainly had their voice boxes and were not ill-treated. So that was the kind of ridiculous story. And then, trying to throw sex things in there too. There was one where they said, oh yes, here's this wild orgy that he was at, and some blurry pictures of someone that may or may not have been Elton with some other man who was not a prostitute and not a minor. So really nothing illegal going on there. Maybe embarrassing, but not illegal. Anyway, Elton just, every time they printed another lie, he just slapped him with another lawsuit. But he knew he had the winning hand, because they are very specific in their first story. The Sun was about, on such and such a date, Elton was with this rent boy at so-and-so's place. And he could prove that on such and such a date, he was actually not having sex with a rent boy at the house of Rod Stewart's manager, but he was in New York City having a business meeting, and not even in the country. So once they started getting down to brass tacks, then the Sun folded and settled the suit right before it was going to go to trial. And as a condition of the settlement, Elton said they had to publish that they were wrong, in a major way on their front page, instead of buried on page 20 where no one's going to see it. So yes, they did. Sorry, Elton. He said.
That is awesome. That really is awesome.
Substantial funds, which went to charity, as is Elton's wont. I'm sure lots of people around the world, this is the kind of thing where people who didn't know or even like Elton John's music would probably say, great, good on you, good thing to do.
Absolutely. And the 80s end on a high note musically for Elton, but now he's still struggling with addiction at this time. He finally gets clean at the start of the 90s. Before I ask you how he overcomes that battle, when do the problems with cocaine and alcohol start? Is it during that first half of the 70s on that crazy schedule that he was on?
Yeah. I mean, it was becoming famous, really, that exacerbated that. Because before then, he didn't do drugs, and he wasn't that much of a drinker. For a musician, he was, he was known for not really doing that kind of thing. But then, as the '70s took off and he became famous, and especially when you're in LA all the time, cocaine is just really passed around. So, yeah, he walked in and saw his manager doing it one time and asked about it. And his manager said, "Well, sure, you can try some." And the thing is, he said he didn't like the feeling when he did his first line. He didn't like the feeling you got at the back of your throat, but still, it got his hooks into him, and he just kept doing it. If you read his autobiography, Me, it's really frightening to read about this. It made me think the human body is capable of just taking such a lot of punishment.
Yeah.
You read about all the drugs and alcohol that he was pouring into his system. And, you think, how is this man even still here?
Yeah. His constitution.
Then you add bulimia to that as well, the eating disorder.
That's right. Well, what was the turning point for him? I believe it was it a boyfriend of his that said, "I'm done, I'm going to rehab," right? And then Elton was still in denial. I believe that was the point where he turns the corner, right?
Yeah, the current boyfriend, who was also caught up in this lifestyle too, finally just said, "I've had it. I'm going to rehab." He's not, and maybe you should think about going to rehab too. He didn't lay it on that thick. He wanted to deal with his own issues. And Elton was just, "Fine, go to rehab. I'm not going to." And he didn't. And boyfriend goes to America to do this. And Elton just went on a complete orgy of substance abuse and inhaling everything and drinking drinking everything and eating everything and throwing it back up and doing more drugs, and did that. You read about that and you think, well, after a day or so, it took him a bit longer than a day. Again, when I think about the human body and the punishment you can deal out to it. But eventually something kicked in. He realized, if I keep doing this, I'm not going to make it. And I really need help, and I don't want to live like this anymore. So I guess that's what they call hitting bottom. And you do have to do that and decide that it's something you want to do, that you want to clean up. And so that was the first step on his road to recovery, which, once he got clean and sober, he just realized what a problem it had been for him, not just beyond the obvious things of hangovers and such, but all these other problems he'd had in his life, like with relationships. He saw the real problem was not that he wasn't good in relationships, but that, well, he was already in this other relationship with substances. And once that was removed from his life, suddenly all these things he thought were problems, he realized, no, that was the real problem.
Yeah, in the 90s, we have a rebirth of Elton John personally and professionally. His work on The Lion King takes him in a new creative direction. The song Circle of Life and Can You Feel the Love Tonight, huge hits. Elton wins an Oscar. How does he get involved with this project?
Well, he wasn't the first choice for that. Tim Rice had started writing songs for Disney with, I forget their names. He started really doing good things with their animated musicals. He had The Little Mermaid. And then Tim Rice came in on, I believe it was Beauty and the Beast, because the lyricist had died. So he was brought in. But now the other people, by the time they got to The Lion King, I think the other people Tim wanted to work with weren't available. I know some of them were Benny and Bjorn from ABBA, because Tim Rice and Benny and Bjorn had written the musical Chess together. Anyway, not available. And so they thought, well, why not Elton John? And Elton was he took on the assignment. He was a little uncertain about it because he'd never written for a musical before. He'd actually done a film soundtrack back in the '70s with this movie called Friends, which came out right at the time he was breaking through in this country. But that wasn't really like doing a musical. That's just a film score. And I think he just didn't quite understand how it could work. But then when he worked with Tim, he found that Tim had worked with Lloyd Webber the same way that Elton worked with Bernie, and Tim would write the lyrics and bring them into Andrew. So now he did that with Elton. Elton also reflected back on the Captain Fantastic album, which is sort of a recounting of his and Bernie's story, a sort of a concept album, almost kind of in a musical way, or in the vein of a musical where the songs move the story forward. And that's what happens in a stage musical. So I thought, okay, it's kind of like that. So obviously it worked out well. you know, because it was this huge, phenomenal success, the first version. Well, they actually both were huge successes, but because they did a remake later, as people may know.
Yeah.
What's the term they used? Not a live action remake, something like photorealistic animation. There's some other term for it. But I prefer that earlier version, as does Elton. He didn't like this later version.
Well, Elton continued to write and record into the 2000s. Songs from the West Coast, 2001. That's another comeback. He had a great collaboration with Leon Russell in 2010. I love that album, The Union, which you include in the book. In 2019, the biopic Rocket Man, which you cite as another important moment in Elton's career. He's currently on his farewell tour, which he announced in 2018. His final tour date scheduled for July 8th, 2023. But will it be the last time we see Elton performing live? What do you think, and what do you hope Elton will do? Okay.
Yeah. I don't think it'll be the last time he'll perform live. He's just not going to go on a big tour like this. He said he wanted to stay at home more so he could watch his kids grow up. Understandable. So that kind of makes you think, well, once the kids have grown up, and I think they might both be teenagers now, but once they reach, let's say, leave school and either go away to college or go on and do whatever they want to do, and you got your empty nest again, maybe he would do a shorter tour. But I mean, obviously there's lots of ways you can do performances that don't involve going on a big tour like that. He could do another residency. He's done a couple of those in Las Vegas, most famously. And I'm sure they'd have him back. He could probably do a residency anywhere he wanted. He could do one in England, and then he wouldn't even have to travel very
do
far.
the Billy Joel thing. He had that long run with Billy, and that's in your book, too, as one of his big moments throughout his career. But yeah, Billy does the one show a month at Madison Square Garden, lives nearby, drop him in on a helicopter, take him home. I think that would be nice for Elton. That would be something I think he'd enjoy. Just one show a month.
Well, there's two things that have happened since the book has come out that I thought, gee, if my book came out later, I'd probably have included them. I mean, you had him working with Britney Spears on this new song that came out 2 weeks ago or whatever it was. And then just the other day, he was at the White House performing, and he was given a medal for humanitarian effort. I can't remember the exact name of the medal. The president and Mrs. Biden come out and give him this medal, which he was not expecting. He didn't know that was going to be part of this event. So it was a surprise for him. Said he cried, but they gave it to him in honor of all the charity work he's done, particularly work against fighting AIDS around the world. And I'm sure there'll be more.
And he turned 75 on March the 25th. He's now 75. Yeah. Elton John at 75. Available wherever books are sold. Any websites that you want to let people know about, Gillian? Any social media pages?
Let's see. Well, on Facebook, I have a page called Gillian Gaar Writer. And that's where I post links to articles and appearances, if I make any, or other entertaining bits. And I think Twitter, it's just at Gillian Gaar.
Okay. You can go to Amazon to get the book, or just the usual outlets.
Yeah. What I like to do, what I like to recommend, since the book is in print, I would go to your favorite local bookstore. And any good bookstore, if a book is available, they will be able to order it for you. So wherever you live, I mean, in Seattle, we've got a great bookstore, the Elliott Bay Book Company. And if you go down to Portland, Oregon, they've got Powell's, another great store. So see if there's a good store like that in your area.
On our website, bookedonrock.com, there's a link for people to find their local independent bookstore. You put in your zip code.
Oh.
Yeah, no, it'll find it.
Great.
So definitely, yeah, local independent bookstores are as important as our local independent record shops, right? So support your local bookstore. Gillian, this was great. Thanks so much.
Well, great. I had a good time, too. Thank you.
As always, thanks for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.